All right. Hi, everyone. So today, this talk is mostly inspired from the Quebec chapter in the book Les Nations savent-elles encore rêver de Gérald Bouchard. I have to go return it to the library soon, so I've got to get this done. Um, the key ideas to take away from this presentation are that Quebec or the French Canadian nation's guiding ideas are a minority conscience, that is, a nation that is bound to be outnumbered by the majority, and a need for a reconquest. Not so much in the warring sense, but through recognition. It is motivated by a need for decolonization, emancipation, and social and cultural recovery. Though it may be possible to trace early sources of these guiding ideas to the mid 1700s, these guiding ideas give rise to two constructions of import. One that lasted 120 years in what Bouchard called the authoritarian utopia of survival. And this construction eventually got crumbled, and a second construction arose, which is known as the Quiet Revolution. Bouchard states that this construction has exhausted itself too, and that now a new construction is in order. Now, I'll be zooming through a lot of history in this talk. The objective is not to memorize individual facts and treat them as artifacts of the past. Rather, it's to think of history as the raw material which roots distinct identities. Our goal is to try to see this identity form and evolve through time. I won't speak on the technical terminology here, but you can pause the slide and read it if you need. And as you may know, history is important to Quebec. After all, our motto is Je me souviens, I remember. All right, let's start with the very beginning of New France. Quebec City was the first official settlement in Canada. It was founded by the Frenchman Samuel de Champlain in 1608. And it's true that initially France had immense imperial dreams to subjugate all of the new continent. One of the reasons for this was the fur trade business for the making of the highly fashionable beaver pelt hats that were in high demand in Europe. But France's colonial rule in the New World lasted only about 150 years. France lost its colony to the British following the 7 Years' War of 1756, a war of global proportions. Anyways, France's imperial aspirations for the new continent was a metropolitan fantasy void of any reality. It's no wonder that they lost. The British colonists outnumbered the French 20 to 1. Could this be where we can trace the beginnings of the first guiding idea, the minority conscience? After the conquest, French Canadians were allowed to stay on the new continent, but they were not allowed to practice business because henceforth you had to be British to do commerce. The French could only work for the English. French bourgeois left, but the majority of others stayed in their homes. The French were also ordered to swear an oath to the king and say that the Catholic Pope is not the representative of God. Of course, no one did. And so it chased any Catholic from any sort of positions of power. This deprivation of rights lasted just over 10 years. But then the British Crown passed the Quebec Act. It re-established French civil law and the Catholic Church and put them in charge of health and education. The act was passed because the British were having difficulties getting the French to fit their system, but it was also intended to gain the loyalty of the French Canadians. This is because it was the year before the American Revolution, and the British feared the French would go with the Americans. The late 1700s was quite the time. Not only did the American Revolution take place, but the French Revolution in France also happened around this time. Canada wasn't sheltered from this revolutionary ethos. European-born intellectuals living in the St. Lawrence Valley with ideals of liberty, democracy, progress, and tolerance also wanted to free the Canadian people from British imperialism. However, their attempts were unsuccessful. The British destroyed their printing press and imprisoned them, while the Catholic clergy terminated their plans for a university. Is it here that we trace the seed for the second guiding idea? for reconquest via decolonization, emancipation, and social and cultural recovery. Now, this slide is just a breather slide. A lot just happened in the world. The end of the 1700s were a crazy time. This is just to mark 50 years or so of uneventful time, well, uneventful in quotations, in Canada. There's always things happening. Now, we'll talk about the first construction from Quebec's guiding ideas, the failed rebellions of 1837 and 1838 that led to the authoritarian utopia of survival. In 1837 and 38, there were armed uprisings in both English and French Canada. Its root cause was discontent due to bad economic conditions, small cliques of power dominating the economy, and the British being repressive towards the needs of Canada. There was a desire for political reform, to have a responsible government instead of monarchic rule from a distant king or queen. By the way, as a tangent, for the French Canadians, the leader of the rebellions is Louis-Joseph Papineau. In Quebec, we have an expression "ça prend pas la tête à Papineau," which translates to "it doesn't take Papineau's head." It's essentially the equivalent of saying it's not rocket science. Also, the modern version of the rebellion flag can still be seen around Quebec. For example, the bottom picture is a skate park just a few street corners from where I grew up in St. Hubert. And we can see that flag. But let's get back to the rebellion. The rebellion was swiftly crushed by the British loyalists. It did not stand a chance. But as a result of the rebellion, Lord Durham was sent from Britain to investigate the circumstances surrounding the rebellion. He published his report, which led to the Act of Union in Canada, and this had further consequences for the evolution of Canada down the line. We won't get into that right now. Let's just take a closer look at the report. Concerning English Canada, he acknowledged that power was monopolized by what has been called a petty, corrupt, insolent Tory clique. But he believed that if this was undone, the triumph of capitalism would bring harmony and peace. As for French Canada, he believed the French-Canadian problem was of ethnic origin and not of a political nature. He disregarded their issues and recommended assimilating them. He did, however, acknowledge that the French Canadians were underrepresented in power and suggested uniting the two provinces of Canada into one, with an equal number of representatives from French and English. This is all well and good, but it created a triple shock for French Canada. That's because the liberal leaders of the rebellion and the other ones were marginalized, and instead the church was instated. Because of this, modern progressive ideals were replaced with a utopic conservative ideology inspired by the old French regime and Catholicism. It is a period that Bouchard calls the authoritarian utopia of survival, which, as we'll see, lasted for about 120 years. It is said that this was a way that the British could maintain indirect rule of its colony, since the Church and the British were on good terms. You see, the clergy was also happy that the rebellions failed because they feared it would have been a repeat of what happened in the European French Revolution, with the abhorrent violence and the excesses in secularity and individualism. However, the church did not agree about the British denial of a distinct people. In the 1850s, the minority conscience became even more pronounced. The French became a minority not only on the new continent, but also in Canada. And Catholicism were surrounded by a sea of Protestantism. Following the rebellions, the clergy feared politics, subjugated the state, and had anti-democratic sentiments. Elites set off to ensure the survival of the people would take place through the path of culture, much more so than the state or politics. The reason being for this little nation were many. They had to withstand the assimilation, the threat of assimilation to the Anglo-Saxon culture, emigration to the United States, the perversion of so-called healthy ideas to liberalism, the deprivation of common morals, the booming of immoral places, which were said to be cities and industry, the taste for luxury, which was growing even amongst the poorest people who, it was actually to their detriment, the self-interested individualism that was overtaking and eroding community, and later the threat of communism, because, communism happened a little bit later on. The church, allied with the liberal professions, embarked on a campaign to prove the distinctiveness of French Canada. Many denied that what was being spoken in Canada, the French-Canadian patois, was a true language. So the linguistic rigors of the French language was imposed on the people. And the clergy privileged a continuation with France, but not the modern French with its post-revolution and post-enlightenment republic. Rather, it was the France tied with the counter-enlightenment and the old regime. The ideas that were imposed were already outdated when put in place. These included ruralism, that is, the idealization of country life and farming, the mother wife who is the servant of her husband, and the predestined hierarchy of the classes. That's essentially a caste system with no social mobility, where the peasants offer things up to those above them in exchange for guidance and governance. But the imposed ideals were too far removed from reality. They lasted a while, but following World War II, the authoritarian utopia was showing signs of exhaustion and facing increasingly harsh criticism. People were rejecting all that did not directly relate to faith, and a lasting schism was formed between the elites and the popular milieus. The practical lives of people were also being affected. As time passed, good farming land diminished, and people were sent to farm unsuitable lands to the detriment of their well-being. A growing sense of frustration was developing when those who went against the church's guidance to work in cities or the states were able to alleviate poverty. And poverty was a big issue in French Canada. In 1960, think about this, 1960 is not a long time ago. So in 1960, 83% of management was English. Amongst ethnic groups in Canada, French Canadians were the lowest salaried, on par with the First Nations. And for an equal education, a Frenchman had 52% less pay than an Englishman. More than half less than what someone in English was making. So then, obviously, it broke. A symbolic moment for this ethos happened in the 60s when a float of a statue of Quebec's patron saint, Saint Jean-Baptiste, was overturned and destroyed during an annual parade. This brings us to our second construction of Quebec from the guiding ideas. It is the emergence from the Grande Noirceur to the Quiet Revolution. La Grande Noirceur translates to the Great Darkness. It refers to the era of the Duplessis government in Quebec, which was associated with outdated anti-modern ideas that were against progress. His party, l'Union Nationale, was conservative, populist, anti-unionist, and fervently Catholic. Duplessis dominated provincial politics from the 1920s to the 1950s. With a total of over 18 years in office, he remains the longest-serving premier in Quebec history. In terms of facticity, the Great Darkness isn't fully accurate. It can be likened to the supposedly dark ages of medieval times. That is, there was still a fair bit going on, at least more than the name gives credit. By the way, the Great Darkness, Quebec has a beer for that. So from the Great Darkness emerged the Quiet Revolution. What is that? The Quiet Revolution was a time of great change where we saw conservative ideals replaced with liberal ones, the separation of church and state, a retreat of the church, so education, health, etc., was taken over by the government, a decline in religious practice, more scholared and secular elites, a new business ethos developed, outside influence was permitted, even welcomed, and a new vision of the world with new ideals formed. Jean Lesage was the liberal leader that came after the Great Darkness of Duplessis. After only 2 years in office, Lesage and his Minister of Natural Resources, René Lévesque, remember that name for later, called an election focusing on the nationalization of electricity. It's going to be in French, but
à l'autre bout de la province, vous avez l'Abitibi, dominée par la Northern Quebec Power. Depuis des années et des années, on lui demande de changer le 25 cycles. Il y a encore du courant en 25 périodes ou 25 cycles là-bas, un des seuls endroits où ça demeure encore en Amérique du Nord. C'est un courant qui saute tout le temps, qui est bon à rien. L'industrie en veut pas, il n'y en a pas assez. Maintenant, de plus que 4,12 $. Maintenant, il y a beaucoup de clients qui ont baroque des dépenses, mais pas celles des profits. De façon à donner raisonnablement ce que ça vaut. Mais tous ceux qui payent trop, ça va être de 10 à 40 % de moins parmi les clients des compagnies. En plus de tout ce qui est payé, ça au gros. Et c'est le contribuable qui paierait pour guérir les régions malades, au lieu que ce soit l'ensemble de l'électricité de la province qui nous aide à résoudre des problèmes. Maintenant, cela dit, parce que ça ne mérite pas plus qu'une remarque en passant, on élimine le passé, si vous voulez, parce qu'il nous faut encore de la place pour mettre au moins un petit aperçu à peu près complet de ce que la nationalisation...
All right. So sure enough, they won the election with a sweeping majority and hydro was nationalized. Hydro-Quebec took possession of 11 companies and began to unify and modernize the different power networks. Although the projects were already being developed during this time, many ambitious projects were inaugurated in the years that followed. At the bottom here, we see Manix 5, which has been renamed to Jean Lesage, and the dam on top is Manix 5. Just to put things in perspective, the dam is taller than any of the present-day skyscrapers in Montreal. Other ambitious projects took place, such as Habitat, the building of Habitat 67, and Expo 67, where we built a freaking island.
Hey, we're supposed to be at City Hall.
We're gonna build it right here.
Ah, yeah, sure. And give wetsuits to all the visitors?
No, on the water.
Hey, come on, we're talking about building something the size of 64 city blocks.
And there's no land left in Montreal.
So, get serious.
Listen, we'll build islands.
How? Dig up Montreal?
They're digging a subway, remember? You take it from there, and you put it here.
12 months and 25 million tons of fill later, St. Helens Island was reshaped and Ile Notre Dame was created.
Come on, we don't want to keep Mayor Drappa waiting, do we?
Montreal's Expo 67. It would prove to be the most successful World's Fair of the 20th century.
Then there's the Montreal Olympics of 76, where we built the Olympic Village and the Olympic Stadium. Regardless of what you think of the architecture, at 165 meters, it remains the tallest inclined tower in the world. And while we're on the topic of sports, the upswing of the Quiet Revolution was a period where the Montreal Canadiens hockey team dominated the sport. They won 11 cups from 1960 to 1980, so 11 cups in 20 years. I'm saying this to try to capture the spirit that must have filled the air at the time. Now, we'll talk about politics for a little bit. You got to talk about politics in Quebec. The Olympics ended on the 1st of August in 1976, and by mid-November, Quebec had an election. But remember René Lévesque, that energy minister from earlier? Well, in the interim, he had left the Liberal Party and founded Le Parti Québécois, a political party calling for Quebec to separate from Canada. What is the root of Quebec separatism? Essentially, it's Trudeau's multiculturalism. I discussed this a bit in my Canada talk, but won't really touch on it here except for this little clip.
Sorry. Mr. Lévesque, you mentioned that Quebec and the rest of Canada are bad partners right now.
Right now, yes.
And no doubt that you are a smart, witty man. And now the issues, as far as I see them, are not strong enough for French Canada to separate from the rest of the country. You do not have basic issues. You do not have, your issues are not convincing enough.
May I just ask you where your accent comes from, just for curiosity's
My accent
sake?
comes from Palestine.
Palestine. Right. No, I was
Still relevant today.
which is one of the most respectable sovereign states of the recent world.
There is some question about that too. If the French Canadians and the English Canadians cannot get along together, how does the world expect the Arabs and the Jews to live together?
You know, let's take Quebec.
Sure,
We're not going to be the first people who are going to give the rest of the world the great lesson of wisdom, including, if necessary, drowning yourself for harmony's sake.
Well, I am trying to put Quebec in its place.
Trudeau lui est arrivé, avait dit oui, je reconnais dit que les Canadiens français méritent des droits linguistiques et culturels, mais dans un Canada à 10, pas question d'un Canada à 2. Donc, c'était d'emblée un rejet de la théorie des deux nations, et là, Trudeau affichait vraiment ses couleurs.
What do you mean by two nations? What do you mean by special status to Quebec? Qu'est-ce que c'est que ces gens avec des petits esprits?
All right, so with René Lévesque, Quebec had a referendum concerning Quebec leaving Canada in 1980. We ended up voting not to leave. We also had another referendum in 1995, and there's still talk of separating every so often, but it seems to me separation died in 1985 along with René Lévesque's resignation. But we forget this part too often. René Lévesque argued that the party should not make separation the object of the 1985 election, but instead opt for the beau risque strategy. Beau risque is translated to the noble risk, and it involved seeking an understanding with the federal government of the time, conservative leader Brian Mulroney. Mulroney promised Quebec the opportunity to fully enter into the Constitution with honor and enthusiasm, and have its distinctiveness recognized in the document. Lévesque expressed hope, and then I quote, that we can finally find government leaders in Ottawa who will discuss Quebec's demands seriously and work with us for the greater good of Quebecers. But this angered the staunchest supporters of separatism within the party. Soon after, René Lévesque resigned as the leader of the Parti Québécois, and after that as Premier of Quebec. And by the way, we also have a beer in Quebec called Beau Risque. Just putting it out there. So because of his desire for the noble risk path, Lévesque resigned towards the end of 1985. The party kept going without him, but that's another story. But then suddenly, on November 1st, 1987, René Lévesque died from a heart attack. I'll just note that the Sovereigntist Party at the federal level was founded in 1991, but I'm not going to comment on this further. Just bring back some old politics with Jack Layton here and Gilles Duceppe. So the Quebec separatist movement has exhausted itself. This is going back to the Bouchard's book. Quebec itself faces a crisis of identity, and there is widespread pessimism and a void of ideas amongst all, separatist or not. When Quebecers were polled about the principal values of Quebec, none of the top 10 answers related to the guiding ideas. The Quiet Revolution did close the income gap with others and showed the outside world that Quebecers, French Canadians were not an inferior people. Now, we've just seen some cool pictures and some pretty ambitious projects, but what about the question of identity, a distinct nation? What has the Quiet Revolution done? And I'm going to take a tangent here and say that even before it happened, George Grant had already seen the outcome. Let's play a little clip.
Do you think in the French-Canadian case it was the continued strength and importance of their religious values?
What is going to happen to them without that religion is very hard to say. You know, I'm not... I don't know. You know, I don't know enough. You know much more about French Canada than I do. Much, much more. I don't see much hope in this kind of sort of Marxist French nationalism. I don't think they're going to build in Quebec and a society that keeps itself different from the United States in that way. I just don't see any hope in that.
In other words, where some French-Canadian nationalists these days would say that they are modernizing their society and building a new and different society in North America, in your terms, they're really becoming more like the rest of us.
Yes, I would think so.
In the very sense of modernization.
Yes, in many ways. In many ways.
So, Quebec is in need of a third construction from the guiding ideas. Quebec can no longer be thought of as before, and deep revisions are in order. It must redefine its symbolic foundation for a third time in its history. We have to avoid nostalgic longings that lead to dead ends, but we don't want to have futuristic fantasies and abandon all grounding, which would cause instability and chaos. So what seems to make sense to me from the myriad of paths that were discussed in the book is to renounce the project of Quebec separatism, not the claim of distinct nation though, and to restore the essential of traditional Quebec by returning to French Canada via maybe like superior values, and the definition of Canada as a binational state. As Bouchard states, it's no longer possible to rely on a strong institution such as the church at the time of the survival, or the state as it was at the time of the Quiet Revolution. Instead, Bouchard emphasizes that the responsibility for this operation is now on civil society, on the citizens themselves. Bouchard's book was published in 2019 and says nothing specific beyond the need for a third reconstruction. All right, so let's recap. Guiding ideas of the Quebec or French-Canadian identity are a minority conscience, a nation always outnumbered by the majority. And two, the need for reconquisition via recognition, for decolonization, emancipation, social and cultural recovery. Beginnings of this identity can be traced to the mid-1700s, but two major constructions stand out. The authoritarian utopia of survival, which lasted approximately 120 years, and the Quiet Revolution and its dwindling off that lasted 60 years. A third, construction is in order.